Probably like, why is a person who spent their career in security at a conference on entrepreneurialism? Well, hopefully by the end of this session, you'll understand my point of view on that. As a security person, we don't just secure the internet one time. Every time one of you entrepreneurs comes along and invents a new version of the internet, we have to secure it all over again. So every company I've been at, it's been a new adventure in trying to figure out how do we secure the internet again. I just wanted to start by saying, when I started doing security 20 years ago, it was not something that everyone was talking about. But something's dramatically changed in the last 20 years. We've all become so much more dependent on the internet that when something goes wrong on the internet, the whole world feels it. There's some debate as to what's like the biggest security issue that's ever happened on the internet. I would submit that the Colonial Pipeline situation that happened earlier this year is probably that. If you think about all the different data breaches we hear about all the time, who mostly gets impacted by that? Most of us don't. A lot of the time our credit card company just picks up and refreshes us and we get to go along. But earlier this year, Colonial Pipeline, a company that takes care of the gas stations along the whole eastern seaboard of the United States, went down because of a ransomware attack. And literally millions of people couldn't get gas for their cars, were lining up at gas stations. It was a massive disruption to the day-to-day life of people. I mean, there's some other big disruptions in the physical world from internet issues, but this was probably the biggest one to hit this country by far. And this whole issue of ransomware, it's fundamentally changing the way companies think about security. A lot more of my peers who run security at different companies who have titles like mine, CSO or CISO, they're getting called into their board meetings. They're getting a lot more meetings with their CEOs, and the question is like, why haven't we fixed the security for us? Well, it turns out like the security team can't fix security by ourselves. We need all of the entrepreneurs in the room to help us do it. First off, if you're thinking about a career building companies, it turns out security is pretty good. This is Momentum, which is a VC firm, tracks all the different security startups. I'm not going to read this list, but like that's kind of what's like 5,000 security startups funded in the last year or two. And so I went back and as I was thinking about this presentation, I was like, what's an entrepreneur? And I really like this first sentence. An entrepreneur is an individual who creates a new business, bearing the risks and enjoying the rewards. Like a lot of people, when they think about starting a company, they get excited about the rewards, the opportunity. I get to build something. My first company that I joined was eBay in 2002. And Pierre, who was the founder of eBay, was an entrepreneur. And he had an idea, and he wanted to bring people together and build a platform where buyers and sellers could come together. I remember I called my mom and I said, I'm leaving my safe government job and I'm going to work at eBay. And she said, what's eBay? And I explained it. I said, people look on the internet, they see something interesting, they bid for it, and if they win the bid, then they put cash in an envelope and mail it to someone and hope that the goods will come. That was the business model. There was no PayPal, there was no bill pay. It was literally put the cash in the envelope and mail it and hope that the goods show up. And you know what the crazy thing was back then? The goods actually showed up. Right? But then the bad guys figured it out, and then they started listing really nice things on eBay and not sending the goods and taking the money and running. And organized criminal groups started building around this stuff, and eBay had to start a trust and safety team, and that's when I got recruited to join. And so Pierre started as the entrepreneur with the idea, and he had this philosophy: people are basically good. And he was right. And the power of the internet, bringing people together. And it was amazing working at eBay because you got to meet all these sellers who were people who were working from home. You know, it was the beginning of that kind of like economy, the gig economy, I think we call it now, but it wasn't called that back then. But a lot of small businesses popped up selling on eBay. And then they started moving across, like the people who were on stage before me, to platforms like Shopify. And so you have those great ideas, but you also need people like me to think about how someone can abuse that platform. The cool thing about every entrepreneurial idea is you have to accept the risk. And what I want to ask all of you to do is when you start businesses, don't just think about the opportunity, think about the risk. I don't think any of the companies I worked at, the CEO or founders were the first person ever to think of the idea, right? Maybe Pierre came up with the auction idea on the internet, but like e-commerce, he didn't invent it. Mark didn't invent social networking. We were smaller than MySpace when I got there. And Travis didn't invent everything about ride sharing when he started Uber. Lyft was coming along at the same time, and there were other things like that going on in the world. So it's not just the person who comes up with the idea first who succeeds as an entrepreneur. It's the person who understands the risks and builds the business the right way who succeeds. In my experience, I was looking back, because people always say to me, like, how did you get to work at all these crazy companies? I didn't actually work at Airbnb. I was on their trust advisory board. And I've gotten to work at amazing companies, but I've also gotten to help a lot of other companies by being an advisor. And I also got to help the United States government in 2016. I was on President Obama's Cyber Commission. And in all of my roles, when I look back, there was a pattern. We were building platforms. I think a lot of you as entrepreneurs, when you think about the business I want to build, you think about it as like I could just be doing one side of the transaction, or I could be managing two sides. That's what we did at eBay back in the day. We brought together buyers and sellers. Facebook, we brought together people who want to communicate with each other. At Uber, we brought together drivers and riders, people who made food, people who wanted food, and people who could bring the food. And so a lot of the biggest, most interesting companies of our time are these platform plays, if you will. Platforms really matter. And so I was thinking about that. Like I found this image on the left here. Like if you look closely, you realize that's a MacBook, but it's running Windows 7. That's because the first set of platforms that I think about when I think back to like the importance of platforms is I think about how Microsoft had the dominant platform for a lot of us when we first got on the internet. And they made a lot of it, and because they were the dominant platform, they had a dominant browser share, right? And then the United States government came in and forced them to give equal footing to different browsers on their hardware. Or actually, it wasn't their hardware, it was their software. They had the operating system. And I always like to think about what was the difference between Apple and Microsoft back in those early days, the first generation of computers that we were all buying. Microsoft made the decision to let everybody else build hardware and they would run the operating system, but they got to control a lot of the user experience. So they had a platform play there. And Apple cared much more about the combination of the hardware and the software and that perfect user experience, and they didn't let anybody else in. And they didn't get to have as big a market share either, because maybe like people like me, when I got my first Mac, I actually was one of those people. I ran Windows 7 on my Mac because I wanted to use a Mac at work, but none of the enterprise stuff would work on a Mac back then. Anybody who was working in 2010 remembers trying to use corporate email on a MacBook or any other software. It was so painful. And then think about how the next generation of most critical platforms came along 10 years ago, right? The iPhone and Android. And they made different, there's two companies that were behind those two ideas, and they each had to make decisions about choosing what kind of platform they wanted to be, open or closed. Like, I remember a few years ago thinking, there's so many crappy, high-risk apps in the Android store, because it was so much more open and they had so much less policing of every app before it got out. But I also remember being at companies where, like at Facebook and at Uber, we would get the next generation of our app together and we would send it over to Apple and we would just like, please publish it in the App Store. And you're like, I'm not talking about like I was at tiny little companies, but because they chose to create that platform, they got to control all the apps that got in. And what's happening right now? Well, we're starting to think about what's the next platform. And as I think about the next platform, it goes back to my title for this talk. As the next platform comes along, we're going to have to secure the internet again. So what do y'all think is the next platform? Come on, it's been all over the news this week. A company just rebranded themselves. The next platform, the next huge platform where whoever controls it gets to make all these decisions around who intermediates all the payments, who decides on identity. Like when I think about security, a lot of the time the hardest decisions around payments. If you look at like the way governments regulate, they focus on payments because if you take away the financial incentive, the crime goes away. If you allow payments to happen, stuff happens. Why is ransomware that I was talking about exist right now? Is the fact that cryptocurrency, a decentralized way of payment, now exists that the government can't fully oversee, have anything to do with this massive rise in ransomware? Okay, so on this next generation of platforms, or this next platform, who gets to decide on payments? Who gets to decide on identity? Think about when you use your browser, you can go in incognito mode and go off on the internet. Who gets to decide if you get to go incognito in the metaverse? Do the users get to decide, or is the person who builds the platform, or is the CEO of that platform? And then when you think about this metaverse as an entrepreneurs, you think about TAM, right? Total addressable market. I did like a 2-minute query online on the TAM, the metaverse, and you see like there's 1 million companies that are coming up. And when I think about the metaverse, I don't actually think about gaming because I just don't have time to game. But you know what I have to do all the time? I have to go grocery shopping. And I don't like going grocery shopping, so I discovered Instacart. And my favorite thing about Instacart is I don't have to go to the grocery store and the food comes to my house. My least favorite thing about Instacart is the person who goes shopping, when they don't have the thing that I want, they don't get the backup thing that I really want. They get some random thing. It's going to end up with like a box of grape nuts in my closet, in my kitchen, and it's going to sit there for the next 5 years. What I really want in the metaverse is the ability to put on a headset that will take me to Safeway right now, and I can see what's in the store. And in 5 minutes, I can pick out all the stuff from that store that I want, and then the other person can take it out and make it Instacart. Like, that's the kind of cool innovation stuff that's going to happen with the universe that's going to make our lives better. And we're seeing so much is happening in this world. And like, I think about the excitement of that metaverse conceptually, and then I think about the bad side. Like, what, you know, at my current company, Cloudflare, we had a situation a little while ago. Cloudflare stands in front of some decent percentage of websites on the internet. And at a certain point, we were in front of a website called 8chan. And at 8chan, some groups started glorifying mass shootings and talking about, and then they would even post before they went to do mass shooting. And 8chan, the platform, was not taking that crap off. And so my company was put in a difficult situation of having to, like, basically shut down our support of that website. Which then, as soon as we stopped being in front of them, they got blasted off the internet. And they haven't really been back too much since. But the point there is, as I think about like the lesson of like 8chan in that situation, it's like, oh my God, when is the first mass shooting going to be broadcast in the metaverse? When is the first time someone going to commit suicide in the metaverse? When are all these bad, like, that's my problem is I've been living for 20 years with the bad side of the internet. When I think about the metaverse, I don't think about Instacart all the time. I think about what could possibly go wrong in the metaverse. Well, first off, as a security person, I think, do I want to be the company that has an app in the metaverse, or do I want to be the platform of the metaverse? And then, if I'm the platform, how do I get involved in identity? How do I get involved in all the other aspects of security? You know, the Meta company, formerly known as Facebook, had a controversy over Oculus when they started requiring Facebook login. Was it last year or something like that? Why do you think they started requiring Facebook login? Because they're thinking about identity in the metaverse and linking it to real identity and managing identity. And maybe they're thinking about it because they want to control it, but maybe they're thinking about it because they need to deal with spam. And they need to deal with all the other security issues and stolen identities. And if you're going to be accumulating a bunch of digital assets in the metaverse, someone's going to try and steal your identity. And maybe they are going to get 10,000 reports into their customer support queue, and they want to be able to filter through from an identity standpoint. Who should they accept? So yeah, when I think about the metaverse and what could possibly go wrong, I think about all of the bad things I've had to deal with in my career. In 5 minutes, I just listed a few. You know, at eBay, we had to deal with payment fraud. We had to deal with lots of identity theft. We had to figure out what's allowed to be sold. Like, do the same rules apply in the metaverse? Like, I remember I had to deal with the strangest things at eBay around what was allowed. And like jarts. People don't know what jarts are anymore, but they were like these lawn darts that had like a metal tip. And you basically go out in the yard and play with the darts until someone got hit in the head and had to go to the hospital. That's how the game typically ended. And we had to ban them on eBay because what happened when eBay came along is everybody went in their garage and said, let's sell all the old crap. We don't use these jarts. We have to go to the hospital. So they started selling them. And baby seats and all kinds of crazy things we had to police on eBay. And I think about what's the list of things that are not going to be allowed in the metaverse. Like we don't allow people to buy guns over the internet for the most part. Can you go buy guns in the metaverse? I don't know. And adult content. Like supposedly some crazy percentage of all the commerce on the internet is from adult content. We don't really talk about that too much at these conferences, but someone's making money doing that stuff. How much of that's going to be allowed in the metaverse, and how does that fit in? How do we police that? How do we make sure that kids don't go in there? If we don't control identity, there's going to be so much interesting stuff in the future as entrepreneurs as you think about this next generation of the internet. I mentioned suicide, self-harm, child safety. What about privacy in this next generation? Like, is it okay if some company is just recording everything we do in the metaverse? How do we feel about that? Where do they get to store it? How long do they get to keep it? Who gets access to it? How much money can they make from profiling us? All of that stuff is going to come back around again. Airbnb and Uber, and also doing classified stuff and eBay made me think about the intersection of the digital world and the physical world. A lot of what we do in the technical kind of internet isn't face-to-face. You know, there's the old cartoon of the dog and, you know, on a computer saying nobody knows on the internet you're a dog. Well, a lot of the time we actually do interact with each other in real life as a result of our interactions in the universe, on the internet. Like dating apps, think about that. I was talking to a friend of mine yesterday, and he was going on a first date with someone he had met through a dating app, and he was going to meet her yesterday. And I was thinking, wouldn't it be, and I was like, how do you decide where to meet? Wouldn't it be less awkward if they could actually meet in the metaverse, and then they could just, like, as soon as they realized it wasn't no good, they could just be out? They wouldn't have to, like, pretend to go to the bathroom or whatever. I don't know how that works. Too old for that stuff. But, like, there's going to be so much we have to figure out in this next generation. And so the last thing I always think about when it comes to security is the more we can do up front, the less we have to clean up afterwards. I started my career, I spent my first 8 years of my career with the U.S. Department of Justice, and I was a prosecutor going after high-tech crime on the internet. And so I was dealing with hackers and people who did child abuse and intellectual property theft and espionage and all that stuff. But it was all after the fact. It was all kind of like going and punishing people for doing something wrong. But the cool part is when we can build platforms that stop the harm from happening in the first place. Like, when I think about the metaverse, I don't want it to be like this dystopian next platform that can have all these bad things going on. I want it to be a platform where we all think about prevention up front. So that's basically why I chose this topic for you. You're entrepreneurs. You're the next generation of leaders of companies. I want you, I have one message for you. It's when you build the future for us, and you build it with the bad things in mind a little bit more than when the people started building the internet. Like we always like to talk about the internet started purely open, like no encryption, everything, every system talking to every other system, and it was a really cool, friendly place. And then, you know, when Pierre started eBay, it was a cool, friendly place where people were good. But now there's a lot of economic opportunity for bad. There's a lot of motivation of governments for what isn't necessarily good. And there's a lot of motivation for people to just cause trouble and make a name for themselves. So when you build the next generation of the internet, whether it's the metaverse or the platform that comes after that, think about it from an entrepreneurial perspective. You own the risk if you want the reward. It's your job to think about the risk. Keep hiring the security people like me and my friends. Keep us around for that next generation. We want to be part of it too. And if you do, it'll be better for the whole world. And you'll make more money too.